And before we get started, we just wanted to remind everyone that the speaker series are hosted on the second Wednesday of every month. So stay connected with us through our social media and website to learn more about the work of IPPNWC and all our upcoming events. And just to note, I know we've already started recording, but the speaker series will be recorded, except for the Q&A in the end. So if you do have questions, please, we encourage you to send them in the chat. And just forewarning, if your question is answered at that time and you do wish to speak on it, you will be recorded also. And yes, I will pass it on to Marissa for the land acknowledgement.
Good evening, everyone. I would like to begin by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we are on today. While we are meeting virtually and tuning in from across the country and the United States, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the lands which we each call home. We are gathering on lands that have been home to First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples, also known as Turtle Island, and I would like to acknowledge the land on which I am currently situated, often now referred to as Richmond Hill. It is on the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and the Mississauga and Chippewa nations of the Williams Treaty. I also recognize that I am on part of the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee and the Huron-Wendat.
Thank you so much, Marissa. Okay, so today we have the incredible opportunity to hear from Seth Sheldon as he reflects on nuclear disarmament and international law, as well as the current status of the NPT and TPNW. So a little bit about Seth. Seth, oh, sorry. Seth is the General Counsel and United Nations Liaison for the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, also known as ICAN, the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize winning coalition working to prohibit and abolish and eliminate nuclear weapons. As General Counsel, he leads ICAN's internal legal affairs and provides guidance on a wide range of legal matters. As the UN liaison, he represents ICAN in promoting universalization and implementation of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, and he also assists governments in signing and ratifying the treaty. After nearly 7 years at the law firm of Skadden, Arps, Slate, Megger, and Flom, today Mr. Sheldon is also a partner at the law firm of Farkas and Newman, as well as an adjunct professor at the City University of New York School of Law. Mr. Sheldon also holds a JD degree from the University of California, Berkeley School of Law, and a BA degree with honors and distinction from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, as well as a certificate in International Nuclear Safeguards Policy from Middlebury Institute of International Studies. He also serves on the board of directors for the Lawyers Committee on Nuclear Policy. Please welcome Seth Sheldon.
Thank you, Clara. And thank you to everyone, to IPPNW Canada for having me today, Leah, Daria, and others for putting this together. It's really great to be here now, and I think it's an important time for people who have engaged with this issue and who haven't engaged with this issue to start talking about what can be done. And so, I think it's also great to be talking to my northern neighbors. I'm a New Yorker born and bred, and I'm based here now. But there is, of course, a very strong and vibrant movement and a really amazing history of activists and activism in Canada in response to a very complicated and troubled legacy of relating to nuclear weapons in Canada that we're all on the path to reversing. And that's sort of ICANN's story in general. Clara talked a little bit about ICANN, who we are, and some of you already know, but in general, just to say it succinctly, I guess we are a coalition of NGOs, really, well, right now over 700 NGOs in 110 countries that are all working toward the abolition of nuclear weapons and through the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which I'll tell you a bit more about. And in fact, why don't I get my slides up and start saying a few things. But I was going to say too, if I know there's probably a wide range of knowledge here. So if anyone needs to interrupt or clarify something, we can make this more dynamic. And I can stop and or perhaps Clara, if you're moderating, can sort of field some questions and interrupt me, just so that we don't lose anyone who doesn't know anything, and also so that people that do need to make an important clarification can stop and have that opportunity too. But yeah, I'll put up, let's see, a couple of slides here. Is that visible? Yeah, okay. I think the other thing to say about us too, and Canada, I guess too, is there's 38 of those, I think 38 around of those partner organizations that we have are in Canada. And of course, many of our, as some of you would know, many of our most important, I would say, and most active luminaries in the movement have been in Canada. And it's exciting to me that it's really, really across all age ranges, as we see here too. So it's good to know that there's a continuum of engagement and sort of enthusiasm that is pushing us toward the right path. And I think about at one end of the spectrum, if we're just thinking about age, we have, of course, Setsuko Thurlow, Hibakusha, a bomb-affected person from Japan, who was 13 years old when when the U.S. dropped the atomic bomb over her city in Hiroshima, and somehow survived, even though no one around her did, and accepted the Nobel Peace Prize on ICANN's behalf in 2017 in Oslo. Setsuko, who's 93 or something, now I'm forgetting, is one of the most inspiring people for many of us who work in the movement. She talks about the day that she was coming out of the rubble in Hiroshima and people were directing her to look for the light. And now the Treaty on the Prohibition of the Nuclear Weapons is her light. And it encourages all of us to keep pushing. But then as I move, or so many people to cite, of course, as we move along the spectrum, but just one other very inspiring close friend of mine, Ray Atchison from Toronto, is sort of a feminist icon, I think, in terms of, and one of the leaders I would say, in bringing us to the treaty, getting us through the treaty process. And I just spend all day with her, so it's on my mind. And people like, we have young people here today who I know are super active and working already, like all the time. In the movement. I don't know if I think of people like Roj Ali, some of you know too, who is, I guess, now in college, worked with many of us, but already an instrumental part in the movement, and helped get Winnipeg to join the ICANN Cities Appeal, which I can talk about too, if you don't know what that is. So yeah, it's just I'm very hopeful. I'm going to start by talking about what's going wrong, but as I sort of transition to what I hope are solutions, I also want the message to be that I am hopeful, and it's because of the people who are working on this, including many of you. And IPPNW, as Clara said, has of course been an integral. First of all, existed before ICANN was even a thought, and won their own Nobel Prize in 1985. But has been instrumental in forming ICANN, and is now on the international steering group of ICANN. So it's I'm sure many of you know a lot about our shared history, but we're continuing, I think, to build a movement together. So yeah, let me start with some of the bad news, I guess, and a bit of context. There's really a lot to talk about if we talk about bad news, and I am right now actually just in the middle of we just finished the UN General Assembly opening, and now we're in committee work. So I'm just leaving the UN First Committee, which is tasked with disarmament and international security. And as everyone here knows, of course, we're in a very challenging moment, I think, in terms of international security. And what we mostly see are treaties falling apart, multilateralism generally falling apart, and a lot of international law generally at risk. But that's why I think it is so encouraging to see such enthusiasm and momentum around what I think is the only solution for nuclear weapons, a total ban and elimination. But I don't know how many of you are familiar with, there's many ways to talk about where we are in terms of risk and how dangerous this moment is. One good piece of shorthand might be the doomsday clock, as it's often called, from the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. I'm sure some of you have seen this, but it helps tell the story about where we are in the world, and they have this metaphorical sort of representation of how close we are to reaching a catastrophe and ultimately nuclear apocalypse. During my childhood and during the Cold War, it seemed like the way people talked about nuclear weapons, it was a constant subject, demonstrations, every movie, every piece of music seemed to touch on nuclear weapons. So it seemed like fear was everywhere and people were really keyed up about this being something that needed to be solved. And that after the Berlin Wall fell and US and Russia committed to a series of arms control measures, that many thought we perhaps escaped a great danger. So it could surprise most, I think, general people to know that most experts think that this is the most dangerous moment that has ever been since the invention of nuclear weapons. And the doomsday clock tries to tell this story, but there are many other experts, even those who are, I would say, are adversaries in the debate around how to solve nuclear weapons, that are deterrence enthusiasts and such, would concede that this is actually the most dangerous time, I think, many of them. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But, that we could, I think, spend a few hours talking about why. But I could say one reason that it is not is the number of nuclear weapons. We actually have fewer weapons than we once did at its peak. So today there's over 12,000 nuclear weapons, but at one point there were over 64,000, I think, and but today we see that they're in the hands of more actors than they ever have been. We see that there's modernization programs, and we see that there's a lot of conflicts with nuclear armed countries. And we also know, of course, that the weapons that are in these arsenals are many orders of magnitude more powerful than they used to be. I mean, and up to thousands of times more powerful than the original atomic weapons. And what we also see is that there is so much being spent on these weapons, and ICANN actually has pioneered some of the research on nuclear weapons spending. So this is a bit of a plug for our most recent spending report, but concluding that there's $91.4 billion spent last year, and this is an increase of billions of dollars over the previous year. So it's a rapidly, I would say, sort of ballooning number that, of course, could be spent on many other things. We've sort of translated how much is being spent into many other metrics. I mean, that this is, that I think the amount of spending this past year was 22 times the size of NATO's annual budget. Not the amount that all those countries spend on defense, but rather, NATO, the organization, their annual budget is 22 times what they spend is spent on nuclear weapons. Or that another way to think about it is that 5 years, I think 5 years of nuclear weapons spending is more than the money that's estimated that would be needed to end world hunger. So this is just a note about opportunity cost, I guess, and what is being what is being spent and what it could be spent on. And a lot of that spending is from these nuclear armed states, but we could talk more about like a lot of the divestment initiatives that shows how, even if you're not in a nuclear armed state, we see that there's a lot of money that's coming out of your pockets too, and in terms of this ballooning budget. And so if the weapons are used again in conflict, what would happen? This is something that a story that IPPNW is quite expert at relating. Of course, it's the core of the success of the work that we've done is to be able to convey to people, and sort of take out of the euphemistic language that I think a lot of nuclear armed states would like it to stay in terms of, just talking about nuclear weapons in terms of so-called deterrence and game theory and national security, and sort of relate the story of what will happen when they are used, despite all of the theories around what these states say is totally safe and is preventing conflict. And and it's really it's when we could have spent more time talking when we're talking about risk, talking about why the risk is so high. The likelihood of use has gone up, and despite perhaps reasonable efforts to avoid use by some, we believe that the likelihood of use is eventually inevitable, and it might not happen because of a failure of deterrence the way it's laid out to us, but rather because of the risk of accident or miscalculation. We've already seen hundreds of detonations, or rather near misses, if you would, of nuclear weapons from past accidents, and that could have spelled the end of the world, essentially, or certainly the end of humanity. So there's a lot of ways to, of course, tell the story about what will happen. Sometimes there's a video that I show that was produced by the Kurzgesagt with the ICRC, but that I think is very powerful. But I won't show that right now. But it's, I think when you really come to understand what nuclear weapons do to human bodies, to the environment, the way at each stage, from the blast to the fires, to the radiation. These are the epitome of weapons that are incompatible with international humanitarian law. They so very clearly violate the rules of distinction and proportionality, superfluous injury and unnecessary suffering, that they could not possibly be used in compliance with international law, and in terms of customary international law. Now, I'm sort of jumping ahead and talking about was going to lay out a bit more about the existing state of international law around nuclear weapons, and one of the things to talk about there is the advisory opinion from 1996 from the International Court of Justice, which has been read all kinds of different ways by different people with different agendas around nuclear weapons program. But one of the things that the court concluded was that the use of these weapons is scarcely reconcilable with international humanitarian law. And I think that developments since, including the advent of the TPNW, would, I think, make it even more clear that that nuclear weapons could not be used in a legally compliant way. So one of the aspects that I think was not understood at the time of that 1996 decision was the long-term and absolutely catastrophic effects that nuclear weapons would have on the climate if they were used in an exchange. And I think that this is one of the developments in science that will affect interpretations around law in a way that actually makes it even more clear that nuclear weapons are both illegal, but also absolutely unacceptable to humankind. I mean, that we would not survive as a species if we actually saw an exchange of nuclear weapons and that escalated to even a medium-size nuclear conflict. In this way, just as a note, especially for those who are seized of the climate crisis, that many of us see nuclear weapons representing the most acute risk to the climate that's conceivable, because climate change right now is on a timescale that is unacceptable, but is also much longer than it would otherwise be were nuclear weapons detonated. And the reason, and I'm going to skip ahead from these studies that recently came out that will show what would happen in terms of two potentially models of a nuclear war, as it were, that would cause cooling and deaths of up to in the example of what they would call a smaller exchange of nuclear weapons, up to 2 billion people. And in the event of a full-scale nuclear war between US and Russia, we are talking about an extinction level event. But I was going to connect this to the climate story because it is this new research that has come out that has added to the modeling around nuclear winter. Perhaps some of you have heard the phrase nuclear winter. The idea of nuclear winter is that that when a nuclear weapon is used over a populated or industrial area, of course, the direct effects would cause millions of people, depending on what city it happened in, to die in the first moment, and then the first, say, weeks after from injuries due to the explosion, the blast, the fire, radiation, fallout. But the concept of nuclear winter, as it's sometimes called, speaks to the notion that as the fires continue to burn, because nuclear weapons are very efficient at igniting fires over large areas, rapidly combining over each other, it destroys people, land, crops, but it would loft all of the debris and soot from that destruction into the upper atmosphere beyond the reach of precipitation, rain, and snow to bring it down, and would block out the sun and cause cooling that has always been theorized, but we have new research showing how it would actually cause an effect on climate and then food production and then caloric output that is sort of the basis for this understanding that that nuclear war would actually have this incredibly devastating effect on humanity and the environment. So this is something that continues to evolve. In fact, right now in the first committee at the UN, there's a new resolution that we're working on to study this further and to develop the science a little bit more even, and to bring it more into I think the general canon of science, so that it's more widely accepted and it doesn't become, this I think, and more widely studied. But the last thing I just want to say too, because it would be really remiss if I didn't say, is that nuclear weapons, before they are used, are causing harm to people right now. We have, of course, we all think about the victims and the hibakusha, the people that continue to live from after the excuse me, atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But we shouldn't forget that, nuclear weapons have been used over 2,000 times through so-called nuclear weapons tests, that the nuclear armed states have conducted, and that there are entire civil communities and cultures that have been absolutely destroyed, if not at least absolutely devastated by these uses, and they go through the entire chain of nuclear weapons because it also people die from and suffer from the effects of the development and the mining and the building of these weapons as well. And so a lot of us think about the first nuclear weapon being used was not actually Hiroshima. It was the Trinity test, and actually new research that came out 2 years ago showed that the effects of the Trinity test spread radiation to all 48 of the U.S. continental states, as well as Canada, as well as Mexico. So people are continuing to suffer the radiological effects of those detonations today. So with that, just a bit of an overview of some of the legal architecture. As many of you might know, and we couldn't possibly cover it all because there's a panoply of treaties, bilateral treaties, multilateral treaties, customary law that relates to nuclear weapons in some way. And it's to really understand where it all fits together, we really, would want to talk about all of it. I mean, everything from the partial test ban treaty, the comprehensive test ban treaty, START and New START, all of the nuclear weapons free zone treaties, Tlatelolco, Rarotonga. Tlatelolco is the Latin American nuclear weapon free zone treaty, Rarotonga, South Pacific, Pelindaba, the African nuclear weapon free zone treaty, the Bangkok Treaty for Southeast Asia, Semipalatinsk for Central Asia. These are all sort of the fabric of the architecture, rather, of the nuclear weapon legal structure. The INF Treaty, God rest its soul, and then in terms of customary law, the 1996 decision from the ICJ that I mentioned. But we're not going to talk about all of it. I was asked to talk about the NPT and the TPNW. So, I think many of you may have heard of the NPT. This is a widely adhered to treaty, entered into force in 1970. It's got 109. Well, actually, I thought it was around 190 treaties, parties rather. So near universal, although non-parties include 4 of 9 nuclear armed states. So not fully accomplishing its goal of non-proliferation, but it has one sometimes say 3 categories of goals, sometimes called the 3 pillars of the NPT. So it's trying to accomplish all of, it's coming out in a weird order, but all 3 of these things: non-proliferation, in other words, stopping other countries from acquiring nuclear weapons other than the original 5 to have tested before the treaty entered into force, and then under I guess I'm just under Article 6 of the NPT. That's the one that's that deals with disarmament. It's a bit cursory and a bit mealy, and it's been interpreted again in different ways by different countries, depending on what they want. Just to say the line, because we can then interpret it legally, but it says that each of the parties to this treaty undertakes to pursue negotiations in good faith on effective measures relating to cessation of the nuclear arms race at an early date and to nuclear disarmament, and on a treaty on general and complete disarmament under strict and effective international control. So, for many years, this has been and continues to be one of the core disarmament obligations of most of the world, the countries that are party to this treaty. And then the third pillar, as it were, of the NPT, went away, sorry, around peaceful uses of nuclear energy. If you believe such a phrase can be fairly stated, but is basically saying that it's basically first says that the treaty doesn't doesn't affect anyone's rights to acquire, to pursue nuclear energy for peaceful purposes. And then it connects back to some of the earlier articles to uh, basically to the IAE safeguards provisions that require states uh, to guarantee that their activities are only for peaceful purposes. And then a lot of the um, uh, there's a lot of the meetings around the treaty are basically a lot of states working to facilitate cooperation on their peaceful programs. So yeah, they have review conferences, but then they have meetings. So the review conferences are every 5 years, except during COVID, there was a bit of a hiccup, of course, and so it got a little bit off track. And then they have meetings that are leading to each review conference, basically every year except one in the cycle. And it's a lot of money, it's a lot of time from states to negotiate these at these conferences and to work on outcomes. And in the last two of these review conferences, they failed to reach these outcomes. That's never happened before in the history of this treaty. And so it's a reason why, or it's another harbinger among many about why I think the environment is really difficult right now, and progress is reversing in some ways, and certainly quite frightening, I think. And so we're working towards the next review conference in 2026. But even the two, pre-meetings that we just had one. I think a couple of you were there in Geneva this year, where again they were unable to reach consensus. A lot of people always talk about, it's almost like a house analogy, like they talked about the pillars of that treaty, and people say that this treaty is the cornerstone of the nuclear weapons, architecture. And sometimes the way I think about it is like, a lot of us who are working on abolition accept that can be the case. I mean, but one doesn't, build a whole house by just laying a cornerstone. You got to build the rest of it. And I think sometimes that, we see the TPNW as kind of the capstone of this treaty architecture. So let me talk a little bit about that. I mean, I think that I'm just giving you a lot of reasons to, I think, despair, but this is the reason that I think we should be quite hopeful. That this is a very new treaty, but we're already making, I think, pretty strong progress in implementation and universalization of this treaty. So this was a treaty negotiated and adopted in 2017. It entered into force after the 50th country, by its terms, after the 50th country ratified it. So that happened in October 2020, which meant it entered into force 90 days later, January 22nd, 2021. It is the first ever comprehensive global treaty-based ban on nuclear weapons. It has a framework for eliminating nuclear weapons programs that is being developed through the implementation of the treaty. And not least, it is the first ever legal framework for assisting victims of and remediating environments affected by use and testing of nuclear weapons. It was negotiated for three reasons. Three, broadly speaking. One, to address humanitarian concerns that I think I can talk a little bit more about each of these, but to fill a gap in international law and to build pressure for nuclear disarmament, even among those states that have not yet joined and consider the treaty anathema to their security policies. In terms of humanitarian concerns, well, I think this is an audience that, and we've already discussed a little bit about it, already kind of probably gets it. But, the fact that nuclear weapons, as I said, cannot really be used without causing indiscriminate long-term harm, that no one is prepared to respond to any use of nuclear weapons, that, if you ask any of your countries, like, well, what are we going to do if it happens by accident or on purpose? There is no plan in place. Because there cannot be. We talked about the new studies on nuclear winter and food supply. We talked about the risk being an all-time high. And I could talk more about the fallacy of deterrence. But that this is the idea is, and there were in the process to the TPNW, there were a series of humanitarian conferences that basically bore out the argument that the only way to there is no response. We need to get rid of these weapons because that's the only way to mitigate against the use is to prohibit them and eliminate them. And that led us to cut a long story short to the treaty negotiations. To fill a legal gap, we have seen that other weapons of mass destruction have been banned. All weapons of mass destruction, pretty much, that we so far have, except for the most destructive, were banned by prior weapons. So this is one way to think of the gap. And then the fact that the NPT that we talked about does not have a ban. It doesn't prevent and doesn't have any categorical prohibitions on nuclear weapons certainly for the nuclear weapon states, as they call them. Nor does it prohibit use. It doesn't prohibit threats of use. It doesn't prohibit testing. And it also has this arguable, or certainly the states that put nuclear weapons in other countries' territories, they argue that it doesn't prohibit them from doing that. So that's also quite a gap and quite a challenge. It's something that needs to be addressed. And then we have these nuclear weapon free zone treaties I told you about, but which are very comprehensive prohibition treaties. In fact, the TPNW was modeled on those, as well as modeled on the other, what we call humanitarian disarmament treaties that banned landmines and cluster munitions. But so the nuclear weapon free zone treaties are really wonderful models, but they only apply in their geographic regions. Then we have the CTBT, but it prohibits testing, but not possession, and also hasn't entered into force. So there's all holes and things that need to be solved. And we know from other treaties that you build the prohibition first, and then we have seen how it has an impact on possessor states, even as they have opposed them in the early stages. So just a bit about the treaty, because I think I'm probably running a bit short on time too. But stop me at any time, Clara, if I need to hurry up or something like this. Yeah,
Oh, sorry. I think just to make time for Q&A after,
yeah.
let's hope maybe to finish the presentation in about 15 minutes. Does that work?
Yeah. Then I'll probably run out of things to say at this pace. So yeah, that works fine. Yeah, okay. So the treaty is pretty short. In fact, I walk around with a copy in my pocket. It's just, and I encourage you to read it. That's the best way, of course, to learn about it. I made these slides as some summaries, but even the preamble itself, I think, is a really inspiring document in itself. Well, didn't mean to skip ahead. I was trying to figure out where those bullets ended. But it speaks to all of the themes that we discussed in terms of harms, but also it speaks to disproportionate impact of nuclear weapon on women and girls based on the effects of ionizing radiation that affects people with more body tissue, and as well as indigenous peoples, because what we know is that nuclear weapons are not built in, tested in, and have generally, detonated around the cultural and power centers of nuclear armed states, but they're used in ways and tested in ways, built in ways that harm marginalized communities the most. And it repeats the line about inalienable rights of states parties to pursue nuclear energy for peaceful purposes. It's basically a cut and paste of what it says in the NPT, but that's just in the preamble and it doesn't say anything more about it there. And a lot of this is taking great pains to make sure that the TPNW can be part of the existing treaty architecture. A lot of the drafters really had it in mind to say that making sure that nobody can say, even though they now our adversaries would now still do say that it's means to in any way contradict or undermine the NPT. It doesn't. So that's one reason that line is in there. And the next line too about, it's the way it fits into the fabric of other the UN Charter, the NPT, and of course the UN's first ever resolution, which was about eliminating. Arguably the UN was created largely with in mind to eliminate nuclear weapons. I mean, that was the first ever resolution of the UN General Assembly, was to set up a commission to deal with the problem of atomic energy used for weapons. So, I'd say the meat uh, of the obligations under the treaty are the prohibitions and what we call the positive obligations, the things that you have to do. And the prohibitions is really just this very comprehensive litany of dealing with prohibiting everything along the life cycle of a nuclear weapon, creating it, obtaining it, retaining it, using it, helping others do any of those prohibited activities, all prohibited. And there's other than requirements dealing with the making sure if you do not have nuclear weapons, then you will not then take steps to possess them, and that if you are a nuclear armed state that joins the treaty, the way you will join the treaty and then verify that you eliminate your weapons programs. And then the positive obligations. I mentioned this in the earlier slide, but this treaty is not only about preventing future harm through these prohibitions toward elimination, but also dealing with existing harm, past harm, hopefully not future harm from those communities that are affected by nuclear weapons use and testing. And in this way is incredibly innovative. I mean, there are other weapons treaties that, including landmines and cluster munitions, for example, that deal with the concept of providing assistance to those who are affected. But this is the first that's ever dealt with it in terms of nuclear weapons. And right now, as I talk about implementation, I can talk too about where we are in terms of developing and implementing, because this is work that can be done now. We don't have nuclear armed states in the treaty. We can't actually, basically, there's no nuclear armed state in the treaty to disarm under the treaty rules, but there are affected states, countries with affected communities that we are able to deal with now. These are, I don't know about time to go into some of the less.
Actually, Seth, I think,
Yeah.
because I know you have to leave and go back to the first committee. Is it okay if we wrap up and give some time for Q&A?
Yeah, I'll do, no, right. I will adjust to that and then
For
say
sure.
2 more slides, because I'll skip ahead just to tell you where we are with the treaty.
Of course. Thank you so much.
And then I'll wrap up. Just to say that, as I mentioned, negotiated throughout 2017. We got the Nobel Peace Prize in 2017. No big thing. And including for our work on the treaty and also for our work to raise awareness about the humanitarian consequences of any use of nuclear weapons. The treaty entered into force in 2021, as I mentioned. So now we're in the implementation stage. We've had 2 meetings of states parties so far. At the first meeting of states parties in Vienna in June 2022, that's where the Vienna Action Plan, as we call it, was adopted, a 50-point action plan dealing with implementing and creating basically working groups of states to deal with different thematic areas of work under the treaty. And at the second meeting of states parties, as there was the first meeting of states parties, there was a declaration. There was, and then we are moving towards the third meeting of states parties. It's a misprint. I meant to say March 2025, so next March. If you have, some of you were there, but if you weren't there, I encourage you to join us, follow us, join our partners, and be part of it, because it was probably, especially if you've had any experience with the UN, this is like one of the most dynamic and inclusive processes, I think. Again, even our adversaries would say this, that there's a lot of places for civil society to do things that in spaces that you haven't been able to do. And so actually you can follow more about this on our website. We have a little sub-page around the work that's being done in the intersessional process, like between the meetings of states parties. just one more slide, just to say where we are in terms of, okay, maybe a couple, but just to say this is where we are in terms of states that have joined. Um, that we basically have 98 states right now that are either parties or signatories. That's essentially half the world. If one more does it, that means we'll have a majority of the world states. And this is a very dynamic situation. Like it just happened. We just had this ceremony 2 weeks ago at the high level week. So we had our basically three new states parties: Indonesia, Sierra Leone, and Solomon Islands. And Indonesia is now the largest country in the treaty, largest country that's a state party, fourth largest country in the world. By the way, the TPNW, although people will quickly point out in the media, does not have any of the nuclear armed states. It does have 5 of the 10 largest countries in the world as states parties already or signatories. Um, so I have a couple of graphic representations of where we are in terms of support, but we're basically talking about 2/3 of the world states, somewhere between 137 to 140 states that say they support the treaty, even if they haven't joined it yet. So, that's certainly a majority, 2/3 of the world, I think quite easily. And we break it down by region as well. We can talk more about this. But I think I'll probably just stop there so we can talk a bit about whatever questions that's raised, and